now we're going to move into E-2 visa developments and adjudication trends. And I think that is
Yes.
Kelly. Yes.
Yes. So, all right. So, yeah. So let's talk about some developments and adjudication trends in this year. One trend, the first one we're going to talk about, Buy American, Hire American, has actually been around since April of 2017. This was an executive order that was implemented by the Trump administration with the stated purpose to create higher wages and employment rates for US workers and to protect their economic interests by enforcing and administering immigration laws. The way that that's kind of been seen in E2s is that adjudicators have started to focus more on whether money has been spent in the United States. So there is no requirement in the regulations that any of your investment has to be spent in the United States. It can be spent abroad. That's completely fine. However, we are starting to see that officers at certain consulates are asking, well, was any of your money spent in the US? So to the extent possible, many people will still purchase inventory abroad. Maybe they gift things to the business they already had. But we still think, it's a good idea to spend money in the US, particularly because this has started to be a trend, based on this new executive order. Another impact of the Buy American, Hire American has been that it's been a little bit more difficult for E2 employees to get approved. So, just basically, for executives, managers, essential employees that are going to come over on an E2, they want to be convinced that there isn't a US worker that could do this job. And I think in light of COVID and the unemployment rate, that's gotten even, more rigorous. So another thing to mention, obviously, is what is going to be the impact of the Biden-Harris administration on the E2 visa. And given the fact that E2 visa adjudications really weren't impacted that much under the Trump administration, especially compared to other types of visas that saw significant changes over the years, we really don't see necessarily any real big changes to the E2 E2 visa program under the Biden-Harris administration. So I think we're not really anticipating any major changes. Things continued relatively smoothly for E2 visas in particular under the Trump administration. And we anticipate that will continue under the Biden-Harris administration.
Because one very kind of interesting thing about E2 visas, which I didn't, you'd think that the approval rate may be a little lower, but the government published approval rate for E2 visas is in 2019 was 89%. So that's they are, most E2 visas are approved. So.
Exactly. So one more recent kind of adjudication trend and development has been just changes to consular processing due to the pandemic. So it used to be at many consulates, for example, the ones we process at a lot in Toronto and also in London, there was a very orderly, timely process. In Toronto, you could submit an application, you would get a response in 10 days, then you'd be able to book an appointment perhaps within 1 to 3 weeks and then get your visa. In London, similarly, they have, maybe 30 days, then you could get an appointment within a few weeks. So all of that has changed this year because of the pandemic. Just the timelines are much more complicated now. Consulates all shut down uniformly in March and then began opening on an ad hoc post-by-post basis from late July onwards. Given rising COVID cases in Europe and also elsewhere around the world, we're now seeing posts are going back to canceling appointments. Some posts have now canceled appointments through the end of the year. So it's just something to be aware of when you're thinking about the timeline and processing at a consulate. That just the timelines are no longer what they were. And because consulates are also working through a backlog of what happened earlier this year, you have to build in that time that it may take longer to actually get your appointment at the consulate. And additionally, you want to take into account, are you in a country where there's currently a travel ban? If there is, then you'll also need something called the national interest exception. So the process has just become a bit more complicated than it used to be. Another thing to consider just is that, for example, previously, if you were in the US, you could go to certain consulates in Canada, maybe Mexico. Because of COVID, that may no longer be the case. For example, Canada has barred, the vast majority of people who are not Canadians from entering. And so even though the consulate may give you an appointment, you may not be able to enter Canada because the country may not allow you in. All right, perfect. So let's move on to some issues and complex areas that we see for E-2 visas. So one, I think Michaela touched on earlier, which is the source and trail of funds. And particularly, we want to talk about this for USCIS filings. So there's two ways to file an E-2 visa. One is at a consulate abroad, where you're going in front of a consular officer and presenting your application. And the other is from within the United States, where you're actually submitting something to US Immigration Services. If you're submitting from within the United States, they really require for source of funds a dollar for dollar accounting of that money. That means that at a consulate, if you're utilizing a gift, you might be able to just present a gift letter from the person giving you the gift, proof of where they got the money, perhaps a couple of years of their tax returns if it was personal savings, and then proof of them transferring that money to you. If you're in the United States and you're filing with USCIS, they may not accept just that documentation. Besides the tax returns, they may also want to see the person's bank statements, perhaps going back quite a ways, showing that they had enough money and accumulated over the years. So it's just to say that if you're filing with USCIS and you have a particularly complicated source of funds, you may want to try to consider another venue, because it can be very, very difficult if you're not able to trace exactly where each dollar came from. This is not the case at consulates. At consulates, generally, if you're able to meet, I'd say they're more reasonable about the standard of evidence, which is, more likely than not that the money came from a particular place. Then it's a more straightforward process. But it can be quite difficult depending on if you have a complicated source of funds.
Kelly, a question that came in has to do with if someone was in the U.S. and they couldn't leave, they have a visa, they were in the U.S. and they couldn't leave to go renew their visa, and they did a USCIS filing. What would they have to do, or are there any issues associated with that?
Sure. Yeah. So if you already have your E-2 visa, you're in the U.S., you want to extend your I-94 essentially. Unfortunately, the consulates and USCIS do kind of treat the applications as brand new. So the fact that you had an E-2 visa in the past, it's helpful for you, but USCIS will probably want to see all of the documentation that you submitted to get your initial E-2 visa. The focus should be on, what has the company's progress been? What are the tax returns? What are the W-2s? But they likely, in our experience, they will also ask to see what is the proof of investment, what is the source of funds. And if they take issue with that, they could also come back and issue a request for evidence and ask for more information on that.
Perfect. No, that's good. That's great, because we've had a number of those because of COVID. We've had to do a number of them, and it's interesting. Applications that were easily approved at the consulate, and we have very significant concerns as to whether USCIS would approve it based on the source of funds, because it's. And Kelly, I think we can skip over the small investment amount just because we talked about that quite a bit.
Yep, sounds good. Right, and so then E-2s for two investors, we just bring this up to say we have many people that come, they want to do business partnerships. That's completely fine. If you both want to be investors, as Michaela mentioned, it has to be, at least 50% ownership. So if it's two of you, it needs to be 50-50. And then as well, you need to be prepared to perhaps invest some more money. Like if you have a $60,000 investment, it's split between two people, that's really going to be too low. You need to, look into investing more than that. Substantive changes to business after filing. So this is an issue that can come up. It's just good to know that when you submit your application to the consulate, you're basically telling them, this is the company I'm going to run. So if you're saying I'm going to run a restaurant, then that's the business that you're going to run. If after you start running the restaurant, you decide, what, I want to, sell the restaurant and start producing farm equipment, you can't just go ahead and do that without going back to the consulate or back to USCIS and getting approval for it. If there is a small change to the business, so you're running a restaurant and you want to purchase a second restaurant under the same LLC or corporation, there's really no problem there. That's not going to be considered a substantive change because it's the same line of business. But any kind of significant changes to what you're doing that weren't contemplated in your initial business plan or application, you want to make sure that you're going back to USCIS or the consulate, or at the very least discussing with your attorney, before you go ahead and make any changes. Otherwise, you could run into issues.
Oh, that sounds great. And one thing I just wanted to, someone had a question earlier, it was actually closer to the beginning of the presentation, but I think it's relevant here. So I'm just going to quickly answer it. Is the question was, I believe, if I have a gas station, what if I want to open a gas station and also run an IT business? So if you're initially, well, actually, I'll let you, Kelly, what would, because we've done a couple cases like that. I think the one I'm thinking of was a coffee shop and IT business, but
Right, right.
but
Yes. So it is possible. Like it is possible to have these disparate businesses under one, corporation or LLC. The thing is that you have to contemplate it when you submit your initial business plan to the consulate, and then you're also setting yourself up for them to say, okay, well, if you're going to run these both initially, you need to invest enough that you have invested all the money that's needed to both start the coffee shop and run the IT business, or to both, start the gas station and run the IT business. So it is possible to do both of those things, but it does have to be contemplated in your initial plan and submitted to the consulate.
Oh, great, thank you.
Perfect. And then in terms of family business purchases, so one other thing on substantive changes is just that you cannot let your ownership fall below 50%. So it's just very important. Some people don't realize, especially if it's the type of company where they're going to raise capital or the ownership structure is going to change, the company always has to be 50% owned by treaty country nationals. And if you are the investor, it always has to be 50% owned by you. And if that ownership structure changes, that can change your eligibility. So even if you have a 5-year visa, if you sell enough of the company that you're no longer at least 50% or a majority owner, now your visa is no longer valid. So then quickly on family business purchases. So this is just to say that when you purchase a business and it's, not two objective, unrelated parties, there's going to be more scrutiny on it. And you may want to get a valuation or some kind of accountant letter or some objective valuation so that they feel comfortable that the amount of money that you're actually paying for the business is really the fair market value. So if you have tax returns that show, the equity or assets of a company are at kind of, 5 million and you're paying 50,000 for a 75% share, you need to have an explanation for that. They may not be convinced that that's really fair market value for the business.
Perfect.
All right. So common reasons for E-2 denials. So one is, low investment amount. I think we've spoken about this, a few different times. I think if you are denied for this reason, a benefit is that if you do have access to more capital, you can always just spend more and reapply. There's nothing that stops you from reapplying. You can also gather more industry evidence to support that the investment amount is substantial. So sometimes you can get a CPA to evaluate your business plan or to look at your your investments and say, I work with small companies and I'm comfortable that this is enough to get this business up and running. So another is the nature of the business. So this is just to say some businesses are riskier than others. If you're buying an established business that has 3 years of tax returns and lots of W-2s showing that it's been able to make money and have employees, they're going to feel more comfortable with that. If you have a consulting business that's really kind of a one-man startup, they're going to want more, to be convinced that this is really going to be able to earn money in the U.S. So it's more important that you have proof of contracts, proof of letters of intent, and a real strong business plan so that they're convinced that, they should, kind of take a chance on this business. So for filing location, some consulates are more friendly than others. As we mentioned, we file a lot in Toronto and London, some other consulates in Europe as well. Some of them are very familiar with E-2s. That means they have a process, they have a system, they're generally familiar with the regulations. Other places are more difficult. There are some consulates where they just don't do any E-2s and they're not familiar. Sometimes that can work for an applicant if they can, convince them that they meet the requirements. But there are some that are just more hostile to the E-2 process. Additionally, if you're filing with USCIS, there can be some downsides there as well. Sometimes they take a more unreasonable stance when it comes to the documentation needed for the source and trail of funds and go kind of far above and beyond, the standard of more likely than not that something is true. So if you have a source of funds that goes back years and years and years and you can't really document it, the USCIS may not be the right venue for you. So another reason for denial is concern over whether your business is going to create US jobs. So for example, let's say if you ran a business in your country for several years and you didn't hire anybody, can be a real red flag. So in those types of situations, we often will recommend to people that they hire an employee before they submit the petition. It's not required, but we think it can kind of help answer this concern. So another reason can be issues with the adjudicating officer. You know, I'd say by and large, the officers that our clients deal with and that we deal with are, you know, very professional. However, you know, you do get officers that have already decided when you show up that they, you know, don't want to approve the petition. They didn't like it for some reason. And the officer does have complete discretion over whether to grant your visa or not. There's no appeal process. So you do want to, if you're having an issue with a particular officer, you want to just be as polite as possible, try to get information on what they were unhappy with. And you can always reapply. And most consulates will make an effort for you to see a different consular officer. It's not guaranteed by any means, but it is something that, you know, that you can ask for and that many consulates will try to accommodate. And then the other, you know, the last reason is, you know, you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So, you know, sometimes we have clients that have come to us after a denial. And for example, we had a client that, you know, had 100,000 to invest. They spent 2,000 and put 98,000 in a business bank account. So, you know, when they went to the interview, the officer said, you know, you haven't invested a substantial amount. You know, once they came to us, we were able to explain, you know, here's what we think, you know, you should invest, and here's things you could spend money on. And then ultimately they were approved. All right.
And we're doing well on time because we have only one slide left before we get to the questions. So we'll spend 5 minutes on the slide and then have 10 minutes for questions, which should be enough time for me to get through the 20 or so questions that we have. Many of them we've been answering during the presentation. So great.
All right. So E-2 renewals. So let's see. I mean, the biggest thing when you're going to renew an E-2 visa is they're going to want to see, you know, did you hire US workers, and, you know, did your company, you know, kind of do what it said it was going to do? You know, what did the tax returns look like? What does the financial data look like? So, you know, some consulates, in fact, for renewals will only ask to see your W-2s and your tax returns, which shows that really the most important thing they want to see is were jobs created. If your industry is one that's largely based on paying independent contractors, sometimes we can include 1099s, particularly if there's, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars being paid to kind of subcontractors and things like that. That can be helpful. You know, that being said, it does weaken your case if you don't have any W-2 employees. Something we're seeing with COVID is obviously maybe people had employees in the past and, you know, they had to let them go. You know, there's kind of an ebb and flow that can happen with employees over the years, particularly if you have a 5-year visa. So one thing we try to do is also just focus on, did the company hire US workers historically? So, you know, if the company over the years has employed people, you know, in good jobs and has had, you know, 10 employees, but right now maybe it only has 2 because of COVID, you know, that's something that, you know, that can be addressed when you do your renewal. But I think that, you know, if you haven't hired any workers, you know, getting a renewal is going to be very, very difficult. It's just something, you know, in order to show that the company is not marginal and supports more than just you and your family, you do have to show that you've hired employees. So the other is, you know, your financial data. So did you meet your revenue targets? You know, are you profitable? Do you have, you know, like did your marketing and sales plan work? In terms of meeting your targets, I'd say that, you know, when you submit business plans, you know, consulates know that these are just projections. You know, it's you know, guesswork that's based on research. So if your company didn't meet its revenue targets, but it's still doing well. So if you projected you were going to make 600,000, but your company made 300,000, that's okay, as long as the company has still been able to hire US workers, you know, and continue to operate. You know, similarly, it's good if the company is profitable, but if the company is running a small loss, again, it's not that big of a deal as long as the cash flow is still positive and you can still, you know, pay your workers. And then as well, you know, kind of, you know, you want to be able to show that you're still kind of in the line of business you said you were in, and that you're, you know, that you're doing well. So you also want to provide proof the company is real and operating. So if you have the type of business where people are reviewing you online, really positive reviews can always be added. You know, if you have the type of business that's really in a heavily regulated industry, you want to make sure you're including all the proof of the updated licenses. You know, most companies now will have websites. You can, you know, include proof of that. And if you have any really large or impressive contracts, you know, you can always obviously redact all the confidential information and include proof of that, as well as, you know, an excerpt of bank statement showing that the company is actually, you know, taking in money and engaging in commercial transactions. Um, and then in terms of, the last important requirement is, do you still meet the E2 requirements? So you don't have to show any new investment. Your investment, was sorted out in the beginning when they approved you. But if there's been any ownership changes, so as we discussed, your ownership can't go below 50%, or the ownership of the company cannot drop beneath 50% for, of treaty country nationals owning the company. And then similarly, the changes to the type of business. So, if your business, let's say you had a marketing company that was said, my niche is going to be healthcare, but and ultimately your niche turned out to be finance. Things like that are completely fine. You're still providing the marketing services you said you were going to provide. But if the business has really, really changed a significant amount, then that could be difficult. So that's something you really want to address, kind of before you get to the renewal stage, and talk with an attorney to figure out, should I go back to the consulate and get this approved before I start this new business line?
Perfect. Kelly, two questions that came in. One is like if someone reaches the 3 or 4 full-time employees and then they go for their second renewal, do they have to have more employees? That's the first question. And then the second question has to do with, like, do they have to go to an interview when they do the renewal?
So for the first question, I think no, like it's not a requirement that you continue to level up on the number of employees for the E2 as long as you have employees. But it certainly is helpful for your application if you do have more employees. In terms of renewing, do you have to go in for an interview? That's consulate specific. So there are some consulates that have what are called interview waiver programs. This has been slightly expanded under COVID. So there are some consulates that will allow you to send in your documents, and then they'll send you back your passport with the visa. Usually you do have to be in the country for that to work. However, I'd say our experience is that even consulates that allow interview waivers for E2 visas, our experience is by and large, yes, you do have to go for an interview. They tend not to, even ones that have interview waiver programs tend not to extend the interview waiver to E2 visa holders. So it's just very dependent on where you're applying.
Oh, that makes sense. And I agree. That's definitely been our experience. I was very, very fortunate when I renewed that they didn't make me come for an interview. I was able to send in my passport. But I think it was just probably because they were so sick and tired of seeing our applications in Toronto. So they they just decided, oh, we don't want to see him. So we'll just renew without him coming. But I agree. It's something that, even though there are programs out there, it seems that consulates are they're somewhat reluctant to abide by them. Perfect. Okay, so now let's do this. We have questions, and some of them we've gone through, but I think that we still have almost 10 minutes. So let's go here. Okay, so how do you handle at-risk funds in cases that have low startup costs, like tech startup, primarily remote workers? In some cases, there are not a lot of costs. Okay, so and some of them I'll just quickly answer. So the fact is if you have a consultancy business or a low cost business, the E2 still requires you to spend money. So when I got my E2, I was fortunate in that I didn't have to spend that much money, and it was still approved. But these days you do, even though it's a business that, if you were starting a consulting business, it wouldn't be necessary to have a lease or to spend $40,000. But we do recommend it, because we do recommend it because officers are often not swayed by the argument that this business is a business that only requires a laptop and a desk. Unfortunately, they're just not swayed by it. So we talked about the loan already. Part-time, full-time employees we talked about. Yeah, so I want to start, this one is an interesting one, and Kelly was talking about some of the risky businesses. I want to start a real estate business. I was on a TN legally. I cannot sell, so how can I start it? I do have my license already. So Kelly, why don't you take that one? And there are a few things going on there, but the question is, I want to start a real estate business. So let's talk about it. I'm not sure what type, but let's talk about it in terms of a home flipping business, because that's an interesting one that we often get.
Right. So real estate businesses are another one that are really heavily scrutinized. Consulates do not like them. They do not like the idea of home flipping unless you're doing it on a massive scale. So to give you an example, we had a client that, was purchasing 30, 40 homes at a time and flipping them, and then also provided property management services. Those are the types of businesses that you can do on real estate. But oftentimes you're going to struggle with, if you're, especially if it's home flipping, they're going to say, is this really an active business, or are you just kind of a passive investor? You own a home, and then you own an asset, you're selling an asset. So those are, I'd say, inherently tricky businesses. The minute an officer sees that it's connected to real estate, they're going to be looking at it more closely than other applications.
Exactly. And we had, just to contrast two situations, we had one person who applied on his own. He bought one house, went to a consulate in Germany, and he was denied, right? They said it's not a business. But we had an approval. This what a different client, we had an approval where the client had over 50 homes, and they obtained the E-2 visa as a result of that. So the next question is, yeah, so this has been answered. So I think it may have been a question that came before we got to these slides. So I'm just going to read it, but then I'm just going to answer it again. Is it a requirement that purchases be made in the US, or that the clients are in the US? What if we purchase equipment from abroad? So this came under, a little later in the presentation, under Buy American, Hire American. The regulations are very clear that you can actually purchase things abroad. They're explicit and that say that the purchases don't have to be made in America. But however, the Buy American, Hire American, there's a preamble that says that everything within the regulation should be adjudicated in the spirit of this. So consular officers, we highly recommend that people make their purchases in the US, the majority of them, if not all, but we highly recommend that. I'm an Indian citizen. How do I get an E-2 visa? So I'm just going to take this one. So E-2 visas are specific to countries. India is not one of the treaty countries. We do have a client from India right now that has purchased citizenship in Grenada, and Grenada is an E-2 treaty country, and we're doing an E-2 for that client based on that. We're in the process of doing it at this very minute. So we're doing an E-2 for that client. So that's how someone from India could get an E-2. We answered the gas station IT, line of credit. Yeah, will we share the slides? Yes, we will. Okay, so this one, okay. Do you apply for an E-2 visa in the US or from your home country? So I think this is probably one that came earlier before we went through this, but maybe just it is something that comes up often. So maybe Kelly, just the what are some of the, like, things we think of when applying for where we apply, USCIS or home country?
Sure. So we almost always recommend that people apply in their home country, kind of for the reasons we discussed earlier. USCIS is really unforgiving about the source of funds. Another reason we recommend people apply in their home country is that most of the time you can get the visa for, several years, up to 5 years. And so if you go to a consulate, you're actually getting a visa stamp in your passport that is valid for, for 5 years. And then every time you enter the US and you travel, you can get 2 years in E-2 status. If you're applying from within the United States, you're not getting a visa. All you're doing is changing your status to E-2 status. And you can get up to 2 years, but you can't travel outside the US. So once you leave the US, you would actually have to go to a consulate and get the visa stamp, and you're submitting a brand new application. It's not like it is with an H or an L visa where you're getting a USCIS approval and that matters at the consulate. For the E-2, the USCIS approval does not matter at the consulate. It's a brand new application at the consulate.
Excellent. No, that sounds great. Some quick questions I'm going to quickly dispose of. So how do you get from a green card from an E-2? There's a webinar that we're doing next week on that. So we were going to send you information on that, so you can sign up for that to get answers to that. Is there premium processing for E-2 petition? So if you file within the US through USCIS, yes. Otherwise at a consulate, no. But that being said, absent COVID, most consulates don't take that long to adjudicate E-2 visa applications. There must be a physical location. This is an interesting one, and I'm just going to deal with it very quickly. So I think the question is, do you need a lease? So we highly recommend that people get a lease, but there was a change that was made to the regulations very recently, within the last several months, which made it clear that a lease was not absolutely required. But it also said that it can be helpful in the adjudication of an application. We still feel that consular officers find that having a lease shows them that the client is very serious with respect to the business. I spent approximately 50,000 already setting up the business. These have been in tax submissions and have included all areas. Yeah, so I'm not sure. It's a bit someone who spent $50,000 on a number of different things, but the first thing they mentioned is tax submission. So I'm not really sure what that is. But generally speaking, the other things you mentioned are fine: legal, marketing, flights, no; accommodations, no. So we have a blog post on our website that talks about uh, good E2 expenditures and expenditures that aren't so good. So just email us and we'll point you in the right direction to that. Um, and someone's writing about law firms. We have actually done quite a few E2 visas for law firms. So both USCIS and consular filings. So happy to help you with that. I submitted an application in London today. Yeah. So what's the estimated time scale? Unfortunately, we don't know. It's really up in the air with respect to, because what's happening is as a city shuts down, then the consulate slows down or shuts down completely. Can we reapply at a different consulate? So because we have a minute left, I'm just going to deal with it quickly. So in order to apply at a particular consulate, you have to be permitted to apply there. So each consulate has a list of rules of who is permitted to apply there. So for example, if someone is in the US on a valid visa, even if they're not Canadian, they can apply for an E2 visa at the US consulate in Toronto, absent COVID, right? They can do that. So, but each consulate is going to have those rules. So but generally speaking, if you live in a country, you applied and you were denied, it's going to be very difficult to find another consulate to apply at. It is not home flipping. I'm not sure what that means. If it's a question
I
or
think it's
not.
related to what we were talking about earlier with the real estate.
Oh yes,
It's just a
yes,
follow
yes.
up on that. I think that any real estate business is something we kind of have to talk about in more detail, just because they
Yeah,
are such highly scrutinized businesses. Is my
exactly. And
comment
that
on
might
that.
be a good idea for a webinar on real estate E2s.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so someone is asking about pricing. You could write to us directly. Uh, it's more specifics on someone's asking about specifics about the Granada citizenship. So again, write to us separately. Yeah, about timing at a consulate. Again, we don't know. In Toronto, we don't know. Yeah, this is a question I did see earlier and I want to answer. What if you entered the lottery for a green card? Will that affect your chances? So the answer is no, it won't. So it's so speculative, right? I'm on an E2 visa and I regularly apply for the green card lottery. So it's so speculative that I think that if you win, we've actually even had people that applied for the E2 visa when they had won the lottery, but they were later in numbers, so they needed the visa earlier. And even in that was one instance. Even in that instance, the E2 was approved, even though the officer knew that the person was going to be eligible for the green card 7 or 8 months later. Okay, have you had any clients from South Africa? Yes, Italian passport. I can't recall which passport, but South Africa is not a treaty country, but Italy is. Uh, and then the very last question I'll answer, what about a construction business? A lot of the home flipping businesses, they're positioned as construction or home renovation businesses, and those have been very successful. But anyway, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation, Michaela and Kelly. It was great. I think you provided the group with excellent information. Again, we're going to send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, a copy of the free E2 visa guide, and information related to how you can sign up for the future webinars. And the next webinar is in 1 week on December 10th, and it's moving from an E2 to a green card. So again, thank you very much.